Hi, welcome to our April webinar number 1 for Orchestra. I'm Sean Morton. I'm your virtual PLC host for the Georgia Department of Education Orchestra community. So this whole month of April, we're going to be talking a lot about assessment. So for this first webinar, we're going to talk about the different types of assessment, some of my experiences with assessment, good and bad, and what diagnostic assessment looks like in our orchestra classrooms. So let's get going. So we're first going to talk about the different types of assessment, what they look like, and just the basic facts around them. So the first type of assessment we're going to talk about is diagnostic assessment. This is our baseline data. This is where we get our starting data, our pretest data to compare all our student learning against. So where are the kids starting so that we can determine where we're going to go? This occurs before we have instruction. This is really like preliminary pretest type data. This can be formal or informal, but it's often informal. It helps us really figure out where the students may struggle, what causes issues they may have, or when the new skill or activity is being learned where we know they're going to just have some holes. And maybe even we may find some holes in their prior knowledge that we want to activate. So some examples of diagnostic assessments that we may use are sight reading. We may use a worksheet. We may use our listening or visual observation as well as pretest data, just kind of depending on what you're going to assess. So this is a model I wrote out for diagnostic assessment. Also, this can also be used for formative assessment, but this is a great way that you could do a quick diagnostic assessment. Either an individual student or the group plays. You're going to process that information either orally and or visually. You're going to identify the issues, which most of us can hear right away, and share it with the students what the problems are, and then they'll make that correction, and then we do it again. So many of us use micro diagnostic assessments all day long, as well as formative assessments, but we're really constantly doing this diagnostic based things as we're teaching skills. So before we teach the skill, we have them play something. We are going to process that information. We're going to teach them the skill, fix the issue, and then they'll make that correction. The next type of assessment that I think most of us are very familiar with, because it's one of the things we talk about lots and lots and lots in many of our schools, is formative assessment. And this really helps us determine what adjustments we need to make in our instruction. So we're in the teaching cycle, and we're during that cycle when we're having these formative assessments. So we've had that beginning of the learning, before the learning occurs, we've had that diagnostic assessment. Now we're in the learning process, and these are like benchmarks along the way. So these can be informal or formal. Often these are still kind of lower stakes. They're not going to count for huge end of course grades or whatever, but these are kind of snapshots. Where are the kids? What are they doing with the material they're learning? How are they doing with that material? Are they all still missing bits and pieces of things? Are some things everybody's getting and other things nobody's getting? Or is it just certain kids you need to target? So this information is really helpful in making assessments on where kids are so that we can help them finish to where they need to go for that end piece. So play and test are often used for formative assessments, worksheets. Again, listening and visual observation are great informal assessments in the orchestra classroom. Exit tickets, self-assessments, peer assessments, the possibilities are sort of endless with formative assessment. But it's just using that information. The data is what's so important from formative assessment, just like it is in diagnostic assessment, to plan your instruction, go back and look for holes in the instruction so that you can move forward, moving towards that end goal. So here is a formative assessment cycle. So you have your goals and objectives that you figured out. You're giving that targeted instruction. You're gathering your evidence of learning. That's kind of where you're getting those formative assessments. So you've taught the skill and that you're working on this set of skills. You're gathering that evidence through formative assessment. You're going to look at the student responses, see how they're doing, see if they're getting it or not getting it. Provide them with feedback, hopefully some individual feedback, and then adjust your instructions so that, again, they have some more opportunities to fill in those gaps, and then we start again. So the formative assessment cycle is a little bit more in depth because you're going to really use a lot of data analysis to try to figure out, hey, this is where the kids are with this information we're doing, and they're on their way to getting the skills, or, ooh, we've missed a piece, we need to go back and pick it up. So this kind of cycle really helps me just visualize how I need to structure myself. The last type of assessment that we're going to discuss today is summative assessments. Again, really common thing we all hear in our buildings. Summative assessment is our end goal. It's our using to summarize all of our learning. It provides evidence of learning. This is usually at the end of the learning cycle or the instructional cycle. It's a culminating event or a culminating experience. It's usually formal and usually has higher stakes attached to it with achievement and grade. So you're really looking to see their best work, their final product. This can be often a playing test if this is, a certain skill you're working on, if it's skill based, a project. Maybe you're studying music history or composers or something like that. Maybe there's a project, or maybe they're doing composition. A concert is often used for summative assessments, especially an adjudicated concert is a great summative assessment, as well as a written test. Many of us at the high school level and even some of our middle school friends are giving written tests and final exams often. So again, those are our summative assessments. Those are looking at our end goals. Did we accomplish what we set out to teach along the way? So during the learning process, you're using all those formative assessments so that you can get the kids to that summative assessment that's really going to count the most for their grade. So again, we're going to collect student data. We're going to analyze that data. We're going to plan, reteach, and do any extension activities that we need to do, and implement that plan of action, and then do it again. So it's always that cycle of going around and around. And we know this very well just from working with students, right? That so often we're teaching and reteaching. And oftentimes they'll have learned something the year before, but it needs to be revisited the following year or the following semester or even the following day. Things like even posture and position often have a cyclical need to be retaught and re-examined and advanced. So this is a great cycle to show that, collecting the data, looking at the data, planning your instruction, and then going through your plan. So next up, we're going to talk about just general assessments in the orchestra room and what that looks like. So for formative assessment, and again, formative assessments are just those assessments that you do along the way, your benchmarks. How are the kids doing with the material? Are they getting a hold of the information? Are they ready to do more with the information? Or do we have gaps that we need to go back and fill? So here are some ideas of things that I find to be really successful in my classroom in the formative assessment category. Oftentimes we use the show me model, like a thumbs up, thumbs down if you're not getting it, or thumb in the middle if you're not sure. Sometimes we'll do the same thing with the bow. Hold your bow up in the air if you're understanding what's going on, pointing the bow down, or in the middle, how are you doing? Air bowing is a great way for an informal formative assessment. If you look around and some of the bows are going up and some are going, that's such a visual thing for our discipline. We're very lucky to be able to see what the kids are doing. Rating scales. Have the kids hold up their fingers. Say, okay, on a scale of 1 to 5, how good do you feel about the way you're doing your vibrato? Some kids will be a 4, 3, 2, 1. Have them close their eyes when they do this so they don't feel that peer pressure. The great thing about Show Me is it's pretty much digital proof as long as the kids have their cameras on. And even then, some of these work fine even with no cameras on by using chat features. So things like a rating scale, 1 to 5, have them put in the chat. How strong do you feel about how good your vibrato is? Or do you understand the concept of F natural? Put it in the chat, 1 to 5, So again, all of these are great ways. Air bowing or even just visually watching the bow in your online platforms, your digital platforms, is really, we've had to rely so much on those visual cues this year. So I definitely think Show Me is a great way. Again, you can also do things like show me the finger patterns for F natural. Show me what an augmented second pattern looks like. You can ask these questions. It's visual, it's quick checks. I love those quick informal assessments. I use them often, like multiple times in a period over and over again, because it's a quick way for me to look around. And oftentimes I'm assessing what they're doing, but sometimes having them do those rating scales, they're self-assessing. Sometimes you can ask them to assess their stand partner if we're in times where we're not singles to a stand, right? So you have a lot of options there. Another great formative assessment that I love, and I don't even know where I stole this from, but somewhere, it's called the snake game. So let's say we're tuning a pitch. Let's say everybody's got a G sharp somewhere and it's so bad. So we just start in the front row and they do in time G sharp, next person G sharp, G sharp, next person G sharp, and you can point up and down which way they need to adjust that pitch right away. So I've gone through the room in about 2 minutes or less. I've heard every kid play their G sharp. They've heard from me what way they need to go, and then we do it again to see if they've made the adjustment. Call it the snake game because we're snaking around the room one at a time. And they have to keep it in tempo. Great way to keep them working on tempo still. Great way to keep them engaged because they got to keep up with if it's their turn or not. Great way for them to listen to others and make those assessments themselves and see if they're hearing the same things I'm hearing. This will also work digitally. It's a little bit trickier because you have to have the kids unmute. So we do this less this year than normal. Normally, the snake is a really popular game in our class, but this year we'll have the kids unmute and say, "Hey," even if it's just checking tuning, "Hey, unmute and let's hear your open D, Susie, Billy, Daye, Sam." So we're just hearing those kids play and really double checking some of those skills that we're assessing, like tuning. This year we've done a lot of tuning assessing because kids are more responsible for their own tuning this year. So that's a way you can do it digitally. Monkey see, monkey do is another favorite game here. Many people call this I play, you play, copy me, whatever you want to call it. So we often start class call and response like this. I play something, you play it back. Or if we're teaching a skill, it's rote before note oftentimes, if we're wanting to work on a finger pattern. Like this week we were working on D harmonic minor. And so we were talking about the finger pattern. And so before we ever had the kids look at the notes, we worked on the patterns. We did the tetra chords on each string. And so I played, they played. I played, they played. I changed up the pattern, they changed up the pattern. This is great in a digital environment too, because again, to some degree, you can see what they're doing. Now, do I know that every kid is exactly playing the right notes? It's a little easier on cello because it's right here. The violins and violas kind of have to angle that camera just so, but you can see them on your digital platforms, which is awesome. So I think monkey see, monkey do, I play, you play, call and response if you like to be fancy, is a great formative assessment tool in your classroom. Exit tickets are another one that is great for, just a quick assessment. And these are great digitally. You can set up online forms, online, you can use the chat, or you can have the kids unmute as they're leaving class, or as they're walking out the door, they're handing you something. If you don't want them handing you paper this year, have them put it in a Google form or any kind of online form program. You have so many options now in our digital environment. Exit tickets are great. An exit ticket can be simple. It can be as simple as tell me one thing from class today you want to practice still. Or tell me two things that you thought you did well and one thing that you need to still work on. It can be more formal, as in maybe one of our favorite exit tickets the last couple of years is after we teach a parade tune by rote, we have them actually write out the pitches after they've learned it to see if they've really learned the pitches, and they turn that in as their exit ticket one day. And so that's a more formal exit ticket. It's still formative because I'm checking to really see if they know what pitch they're playing, but it's a great way for me to check. So you have some options there with exit tickets to be formal or informal, and they work pretty well digitally. Some other options are to use paste programs like Nearpod or Pear Deck, which many of your counties have subscriptions to. There are free versions of those things. ClassKick, any kind of polling software. There's so many options out there. These are great for just doing quick formative checks with kids. So for more formal assessments, you can do things that are self-assessments or peer assessments using rubrics to make it more formal. So you give them the rubric and say, okay, using this rubric, rate your vibrato using this scale or whichever thing you want to be rating. Or they can rate each other. And again, this can be formal and still not count for a grade. Formative and formal don't mean it has to be a grade. It just means it's got a more formal process. Online forms are awesome for this. There's so many programs out there now that are free and amazing for you to try. Playing tests using a rubric, really making sure that kids have the rubrics ahead of time, I think is really important so they know what they're graded on. If you're assessing a skill, I think too, making the rubric very narrow so that they're not trying to focus on too many things. Now, if you're in digital times, the digital crossover to me is using these online grading platforms. So there's many options out there of programs that have the music built into it and that will grade it using an algorithm. Not perfect. However, it's an option and it gives you another way to get things done. Pre-evaluation concerts are a more formal formative assessment, but you were using the rubric from GMEA. Another option is recording and watching back together using that rubric and having the students use the rubric to evaluate, or using a digital version of music and having students use the evaluation rubric. So, for example, let's say you want kids to really focus on the quality of performance. So you find multiple performances on all the YouTubes and all the things that are out there now. And the students can watch that, and using the rubric, they can grade it. Students are infinitely harder on others and even themselves sometimes. So, letting them have that experience of formally evaluating themselves and each other and other students too. And then you can do a quiz for formative assessment. Maybe you're assessing vocabulary, or maybe you're assessing music theory skills, or all sorts of things. You can do a digital quiz. You can use programs like Quizzes, Kahoot, so many online digital platforms that are free. Or maybe your county already has something set up nice for you. If not, there's lots of free stuff. But quizzes are another way. Again, it can be a low stakes grade or no grade, but the goal with all these formative assessments is to collect that data and to be able to go back and say, okay, I see you guys really understand key signatures, but you don't really seem to be getting what we're talking about with minor scales. So let's go back and try it again another way. So you're using that information to really inform your instruction and plan your instruction and make adjustments in your instruction. So summative assessments in orchestra, I think many of us are pretty comfortable with these ideas because these are like the big things that we do. So playing tests, again, are great for summative assessments. Again, a clear rubric I think is really important when you're doing a playing test. I think students need to know what they're being evaluated on so that they can prepare. I think also being able to work for mastery is really important. So if they don't do well, they should have another chance at it, because the goal should be mastery in our programs. If the kid never learns to play an F natural and doesn't ever go back and try to fix it, it's probably never going to get better. So mastery, I think, is really important with any of these playing assessments and opportunities. And again, digitally, we can use online grading programs or programs that have our music built into them that grade with an algorithm. Again, the algorithm isn't perfect, but it gives us a jumping off point. Flipgrid is another free option where students can submit playing tests. You can moderate on Flipgrid so only the teacher sees it, which our kids really like. They get all weird about that. So lots of options there. Written test, again, digitally, that's easy to do now. I think many of us are getting more and more comfortable with that. There's lots of online platforms, quizzes, forums, etc., that you can do to create written digital tests. Concert performances, adjudicated especially, I think, are great for summative assessments. Digital recordings, virtual performances, those are all things also that you can use for summative assessments. But I think it's really nice to have adjudicated performances at least once a year during the normal times. And so those are great ways that we can assess our students summatively. And then finally, projects. Many of us teach in schools where maybe project-based learning has taken a hold or has been a hold for a long time. So learning to embrace that concept instead of fight it, I think, can be a really great way for us to get that summative assessment piece in. And again, online submissions now, I think many of us have learned to use technology in a way that will enhance our program and is not going to make it more burdensome for us. And I think we'll be able to use those things moving forward in the future. But digitally submitting things, having students create different items digitally, I think is a great way, and collaboratively, it makes it a lot easier for them to collaborate digitally sometimes too. So assessment obstacles, some things that I've run into as a teacher, and I'm sure some of you have too. One of the big obstacles to assessment is time. Many of us are so fortunate in the Georgia area that we teach in very large programs. We have nice, healthy programs with many students. But when you start talking about grading that amount of assignments in time, it's overwhelming some days. So, with I have 315 students, a lot of students in my program. We start grading those assignments. That can really back up fast if you get a couple weeks behind in grading. So, a couple of solutions that we've come up with for assessments. We use lots of informal assessment. We use lots of non-graded assessments. We do a lot of student-centered assessments, meaning self-assessments, peer assessments. Those things work very well. In addition, one thing that has helped us immensely this year is using audio feedback instead of typing feedback or writing feedback. Many of the online platforms allow you to record your feedback. You can send feedback audio wise and Remind. We can send feedback in our student management portal audio wise. And so doing audio feedback, first of all, I find I give clearer, more concise, and more detailed feedback. So they get more information, but it always seems more concise and they just get what they need from me. And they get to hear my voice and know exactly the tone I'm saying things. And it's such a time saver and a finger saver typing all those comments and things in. So for me, that's been a huge help is using informal assessments, student-centered assessments, audio feedback, and then also using things that grade themselves is very helpful. Programs that will grade it for you, whether it's a form, a test, some sort of algorithm based program that records them playing. Finding things that will grade themselves has also been a huge time saver this year. Online theory, any of that stuff. Another assessment obstacle is grades. Students are very, very concerned with grades. And at the high school level, it's a higher stakes situation because grades are going to be looked at when they apply for college and university or even going into the workforce. And so we want students to want to do well. We also don't want to make it a meltdown situation. And so our solution is always to provide multiple opportunities for mastery. So if a student doesn't do well on an assessment, they can take it over in our class. And I think that's really important because my goal is not for them to just take the test and be done with it. My goal is for them to master the skill. And it's the only class I tell kids that their ability affects other people's experience. So if we're on stage and half the violas don't play an F sharp and the piece has an F sharp, it's going to affect the whole group's experience. And so it's really important that they understand how much they're responsible to the group and why it's important that they go for mastery. Also, I think with grades, making the kids aware ahead of time what's expected with rubrics that are clear and very concise so that they know exactly what to focus on as they're preparing. These kids have limited time to practice, many of them, and they're super busy. So we have to give them very obtainable, clear goals. And then finally, not grading everything, I think, is really important. Using a lot of formative assessments and quick assessments that you don't necessarily take a grade for, I think is really great just for you to have information, but for them to not get so stressed out always about the grade and to learn that it's okay to not be perfect at everything the first time. This is very good for kids. Okay, the next one I think that comes up a lot when we're talking about obstacles in assessment is separating the behavior from their knowledge. So many of us work in counties where they make it very clear we cannot grade based on behavior. So the way that we have found that, we want to assess their knowledge of the curriculum, but part of our curriculum is behavior, not necessarily, chewing gum or whatever, but it's the rehearsal competency, how they interact in a rehearsal, and it's part of our standards, right? So we've worked it out. So part of their grade is rehearsal competency, and it's a summative part of their grade. Now, again, this is measuring those competencies in rehearsals. Are they doing the right things? Blah, 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 blah. It's not measuring some other weird thing and they're playing. That's a different thing. So making sure that the parents understand this is more of looking at how they're meeting what is required in a rehearsal, and that's actually part of our Georgia Standards of Excellence, which is different from a skill that you're assessing. And while we all know rehearsal competency is a skill, sometimes it's hard to make others understand. So that has helped us make sure that students understand that their behavior is separate from their knowledge. Data tracking. So you do all of these assessments. How in the world do you track who knows what? And especially when you start talking about having lots of students in our classes. So for me, quick notes or in my iPad Pro is really helpful. Some people love to use Excel and they track. Elementary teachers are masters at this. They track all the kids and they mark it off when they see a skill. I don't know that I can function like that. Some people are great at that. That's a lot to keep up with. But I like to make a lot of just quick notes, absorb things I see visually in class. If I notice that all the cellos in one class period cannot play an extension, I'm pretty sure I'm going to remember that, but I'm going to write it down in my planner because I have a class planning book that I keep. Go back and review, So really, data tracking is hard, but I think you have to be intentional about making notes and just keeping information in a format that works for your brain. So the big gap we get into with assessment is that students are so focused on the grade. And teachers, we're more focused on how to close the gaps and what those gaps are. How can we make those gaps not exist anymore? So you have the students who are super, super grade focused. We're super, super information focused. And there's this gap in the middle that we need to fill. So motivating kids through the process and having them understand that you can get better. I think the big key to filling that gap is letting students work for mastery. So, but let's talk about how we motivate through the assessment process. Okay, so one of the things I think that's really helpful for keeping kids motivated is varying your assessments. Don't always have a playing test. Use a lot of informal assessment. Use tickets out the door. Use forms. Use online quizzes. Variation helps keeps kids interested. It keeps them excited. And as one of my good friends always says, we're in the edutainment business, right? Education has changed dramatically. Kids are used to shiny, bubbly, bright, blinky lights, right? So we have to sort of make sure that we keep up with the style of learning that they're used to. Encourage student involvement in your assessment process. So I think using self-assessments is really helpful in that aspect, peer assessments, but making them part of the process. Have them choose. The kids know what the hardest spot in the music is. Have them choose it so that they can have a piece of the pie in that summative assessment process or in your formative assessment process. Make assessments quick and easy sometimes. It doesn't all have to be heavy. Just using your eyes and your ears. Let them use their eyes and ears. Use some of those quick checks. Use some of those monkey see, monkey do's. Use some visual cues. Anything you can do that's going to make it easier for yourself. I also think students do better and are more motivated when they know what to expect. No one really likes surprises at the end, especially when it comes to their grades. Many of our kids are super, super high achievers, and so they especially are grade focused, and we don't want to alienate those kids by suddenly having no grades in the grade book and then suddenly they've got a weird grade that they didn't know about. So really having clear expectations, making it known what they're going to get so that there's no confusion. And then I think multiple opportunities for mastery is super important to keep kids motivated. If they know that, okay, I failed this playing exam the first time, but now I'm going to go back and try it again now that I understand a little better, and then I can get a better grade, that shows them that there's room for growth. That sometimes we don't do things right the first time, and that's kind of okay. Now, we know that you can't play a concert twice, but that's why we practice so much ahead of time. We practice and practice and practice to get that perfection level. And I think it's really important we teach kids that that's okay to also do when it comes to assessments in our class. And then provide students with helpful, clear feedback. If they know exactly what to fix and how to fix it or what's wrong, and you don't just say good, bad, nope, that's just not enough for them. If you say to them, hey, I loved the way that you used your vibrato to play artistically. However, your bow arm is having some real issues. Here are what the problems are, blah, 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 blah. That to them is so much easier to understand than nope, or yeah, that was fine. That's just not enough information. And if we give kids false positives or negatives with no explanation, they don't really know what to do with that. So I think if we want to build that trust with kids and keep them motivated, then we really have to be clear with them and give them those helpful pieces of feedback. All right, the last section we're going to talk about is diagnostic assessment. So again, let's just review. Diagnostic assessment is our baseline. It's that jumping off point for where our students are. It helps us build our curriculum, plan what skills we need to teach, because maybe they already had a skill we didn't know they had. So we got that from our baseline data, and so we don't need to spend time on that, or maybe we just need a quick review on something. It helps us program music. To me, that's a huge one. If my students do not understand any of the things that have to do with low twos or backwards extensions, then I am probably not going to program a piece with 94 flats. I may program a piece with one flat. Or I may program a piece with in G major or C major and work back towards flats. So it really helps us to know that diagnostic information as we program our literature and for our students. It also helps us develop our remediation plans and our extension plans. We're asked more and more to provide differentiation for our students in the schools. And so having a plan based on what we know of our students from that diagnostic data, knowing, okay, this student is really struggling with his skills, so they need extra work to get caught up. This student already can do all of these things, so I need to give them these extension activities. It helps us develop those activities for students. It also allows us to help ability group our ensembles or divide our ensembles evenly. So for example, maybe you want to ability to group your ensembles at the high school level, have an advanced group and an intermediate and then introduction type group. Okay, that makes sense. Or maybe you want to divide your groups equally and you don't want to put all your strong kids in one class. Well, that diagnostic information is really helpful. You probably know how most of the kids play, but sometimes we hear stuff and it's really surprising. So using that information from a diagnostic assessment can help us divide kids. Usually these diagnostic assessments are low stakes. They don't count as a grade. They're really for informational purposes for the teacher. They're what we call pre-tests usually. And they're just very, very helpful for us to get information, but it doesn't really do anything for the kids. They're really teacher-centered. So here are some of your options for diagnostic assessments in the orchestra classroom. You can do pre-tests on terminology, symbols, music theory, solfege, whatever floats your boat. Any kind of pre-test is great. Worksheets, something that's going to ask them some questions to see what they know. It seems less scary than the word pre-test. You have a worksheet, just see what they know. Checklist, a skill checklist, have them checking off skills, or you can check off skills. You can do slides where they create some slides for you, Padlets where they answer information or answer questions. Or there's all sorts of other digital tools out there. And then you can use formal exit tickets. So informally, some options are sight reading. That's a great diagnostic assessment. If you put a piece in front of your group and they can't really get beginning to end, it's probably too hard. If they can kind of get beginning to end, then you could probably teach it, right? So knowing what your kids can do, sight reading is a great way to kind of diagnostically decide, like, where are they and what can we do? Rating scales are good for diagnostic assessments that are informal. Having the kids self-assess or rate themselves. Again, you can use informal exit tickets as well as formal exit tickets. And then a lot of us just use visual and oral evaluation to try to figure out diagnostically what's going on. That's our quickest tool, and that's probably the one that we do hundreds and hundreds of times a day, just hearing and seeing things and making recommendations and telling kids what to fix. So here's an example of a quick diagnostic assessment for students. So we use this Georgia Standard of Excellence of utilizing correct finger patterns and scales and repertoire in these keys. So, and then the learning target for this particular GSE would be, I can play the notes F natural and C natural. So here's an example of an informal diagnostic assessment. Have the students close their eyes, hold up the finger pattern for F natural on the D string. Then have them hold up the finger pattern for C natural on the A string. So again, they're closing their eyes, so you're seeing only what they know, but you're also able to quickly assess, do they know this? Do they know this? What What do they know? Do they already know those patterns? Or is every kid in the cello section doing this for F natural? That's probably going to be a problem. Is every kid in the violin section doing this for F sharp on the D string? Well, then you got a problem, okay, because you wanted to do this. So again, using that quick, that's such a quick diagnostic assessment. But man, it's so helpful to look around and know who's got it or who doesn't. Formally, you could have students submit a selfie of their finger patterns. So they send in a little selfie of the finger patterns, and then that's more formal because you have evidence of the learning or evidence of what they know. So again, you can choose to do either, but you're getting the information either way. It just depends on how you want to collect it. So that wraps up our first webinar for the month of April on assessment. So I really am excited to hear your feedback and hear what you're doing with assessment. I think we're being asked to do more and more formal assessments every year in our classrooms. And so I'd love to hear your input and see what you think and what's going on in your classrooms and what you're doing diagnostically, and especially how you're using it digitally. So hop on and add some comments to our discussion post this month. And I hope to see you at our second webinar this month, which will cover some more assessment tools.